on what looked like a normal evening in Palu. His passengers were ready, the sky was clear, and every instrument showed nothing unusual. Yet in the middle of this calm, he heard something no one else could. A whisper echoed in his mind, urgent and insistent, telling him to leave at once. Against all training and routine, he listened.
Mga dari situ hektik mulai. Saya panggil orang ground staff, bro, gua mau berangkat cepat, lu siapin penumpang sekarang.
Moments later, that decision saved 148 lives. But what was that voice? A product of instinct or something far beyond explanation? Captain Ricoetta Mafella had flown many routes across Indonesia, and routine had become second nature to him. He was known as a disciplined pilot who respected the rules, checked every detail, and trusted the structure of aviation procedures. Yet on that September evening in Palu, something disturbed the sense of order that usually guided his work. As he sat in the cockpit of Flight 6231, he felt a strong unease that he could not explain. It was not the weather, because the sky above was calm. It was not the instruments, because every reading showed normal. Instead, it was a voice deep in his mind, repeating one urgent command: leave now. Pilots are trained to follow checklists and schedules because safety depends on discipline. Taking off earlier than planned is rare, and most professionals would consider it reckless. But Mafella could not shake the feeling that waiting meant danger. He looked at the time, listened to the humming engines, and realized he could no longer ignore the signal pressing on his conscience. Turning to his crew, he gave a surprising order. They would request clearance immediately, 3 minutes before their slot. His co-pilots hesitated, aware that it was unusual, but they trusted his confidence and supported the choice. When he radioed the tower, the young controller on duty, Antonius Gunawan Agung, heard the urgency in the captain's voice. It was not the normal calm request. It carried a weight that suggested more than impatience. Although early departures were uncommon, Agung responded without questioning. Batik 6231, clear for takeoff. With that short exchange, the course of history quietly shifted. Mafella pushed the throttle forward and the aircraft began to roll down the runway, faster and faster until it lifted free of the ground. Inside the cabin, 148 passengers relaxed into their seats, unaware that the decision had already placed them outside the reach of catastrophe. Some opened books, others closed their eyes, and a few looked through the windows as the Indonesian coastline stretched below them. In the cockpit, however, the captain's heart pounded. He still felt a mix of fear and relief because even though the plane was airborne, he knew something unseen had forced his hand. The mysterious instinct was not gone, but now it carried the comfort of having acted in time. Looking back later, Mafella would describe the moment as one of the strangest in his career. He had no evidence, no warning lights, no technical reason to break protocol. Still, he trusted a whisper in his mind that told him action could not wait. That choice became the invisible line separating life from death. For the passengers who never even realized what had happened, it was just a smooth departure. For the man in command, it was a haunting reminder that instinct can sometimes see what reason cannot. But what was waiting for them only minutes after takeoff would prove that his decision was not superstition at all. So what exactly happened on the ground the moment Flight 6231 left Palu behind? As the aircraft accelerated, the runway lights blurred into streaks and the engines roared with growing force. The Boeing A320 lifted into the evening air, climbing smoothly over Palu. In that instant, Captain Mafella felt his chest loosen, as if a hidden weight had been removed. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to breathe, believing that the danger, whatever it was, had been left behind on the ground. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was ordinary. Passengers settled in for the short journey, adjusting seatbelts, pulling out snacks, or letting the soft vibration of the engines lull them into calm. Nothing about their behavior hinted that they had just escaped disaster. But only 3 minutes after takeoff, the situation on the ground changed with terrifying speed. At 6:05 p.m., a violent earthquake struck Palu with a magnitude of 7.5. The ground convulsed as if it were a living thing, splitting concrete and shaking entire buildings to their core. The runway that had just launched, Flight 6231, began to crack and shift, long jagged lines running across the surface like broken glass. The air traffic control tower, a 4-story structure overlooking the field, swayed dangerously as if it could collapse at any second. For anyone still at the airport, there was no safety left. In the sky, the passengers remained unaware of the destruction. Through the windows, they saw the coastline glowing in the fading light, never realizing that the same coastline was now bending under the power of seismic waves. The captain tried once to call the tower, but there was no answer. He tried again, and silence filled the radio. What he did not yet know was that communication had been cut not by technical failure, but by chaos. The controllers were fleeing for their lives as the building crumbled around them. The difference between survival and tragedy was measured in minutes. If the flight had waited on the runway as planned, the violent shaking would have struck before the plane could leave the ground. The asphalt would have split beneath the landing gear, trapping the aircraft in a deadly situation with no way to escape. With 148 people on board, the consequences would have been unimaginable. Instead, the simple act of taking off early placed them beyond the reach of the earthquake at the exact moment it unleashed its full force. The truth of those 3 minutes only became clear later, but even in the cockpit, Mafela sensed the scale of what was happening below. He had no words for the feeling, only a tightness in his chest as he scanned the horizon. He knew they had left just in time, but he could not yet see the second danger that the earthquake had awakened. Because earthquakes in coastal Indonesia rarely end with shaking alone. The violent motion often passes its energy to the sea, and the sea answers back. What was rising beneath the waves would soon reveal itself to the man looking down from the sky. From the cockpit, the world below seemed to break apart in slow motion. Captain Mafela looked down through the glass and saw the ocean behaving in a way that no training manual could describe. Great rings of water began to expand outward, spreading like ripples after a stone struck a pond, only these ripples grew into walls. At first, he thought he was watching strange patterns of light, but within seconds, he realized they were waves, rising higher and pushing further from the shore. The sea was no longer calm. It was building something monstrous, a force that would soon swallow everything in its path. At 1,500 feet, the aircraft had a vantage point that few people ever see during such disasters. The coastline of Palu stretched below, twisting as if it were alive. From above, Mafela could see structures collapsing and dust clouds rising where neighborhoods once stood. Roads split apart like torn paper, and fire sparked from ruptured lines. He tried again to reach the control tower, calling once, twice, and a third time. Each attempt ended in silence. The empty radio sent a chill down his spine because he knew something had gone terribly wrong. In those moments, the absence of sound carried more weight than any scream. For the passengers, the view through their small windows was limited, but some began to notice unusual movements of the ocean. A few pointed toward the coastline, whispering in confusion as the circular waves spread wider. Still, most remained unaware of the scale of destruction that was unfolding beneath them. Inside the cockpit, however, the captain's instincts told him that this was more than an earthquake. The sea had absorbed the shock and was now unleashing its answer in the form of a tsunami. He pressed his hand against the throttle, keeping the climb steady, as if altitude alone could put distance between the plane and the chaos below. Every second in the air felt stretched. The captain understood that while his passengers were safe for now, thousands on the ground faced an impossible fight. Palu, a city of over 300,000 people, lay directly in the path of the rising water. From his height, he could already see the dark shapes rolling toward the shore, curling and folding as they gained strength. The waves were not just moving straight, they were forming arcs, encircling the bay with crushing precision. The natural shape of the coastline acted like a funnel, directing the force into the heart of the city. Mafela would later describe the scene as surreal, a nightmare that unfolded in daylight. He could not intervene, yet he could not look away. His duty was to guide his aircraft onward, but his eyes remained fixed on the destruction below. He knew the silence on the radio was no accident. Somewhere in that swaying tower, a young man was still at his post, holding on to his responsibility as the world collapsed. The question was not whether Palu had been struck, but how long anyone could survive inside the breaking city. And as the plane continued north, another story was already being written on the ground, one of courage and sacrifice inside a crumbling tower. While the aircraft climbed into safer skies, chaos ruled inside the 4-story control tower at Palu Airport. The earthquake's force shook the entire structure as if it were caught in the grip of a giant hand. Ceiling tiles shattered and fell like rain. Windows burst outward and equipment toppled across the floor. Controllers who had been guiding multiple flights seconds earlier suddenly faced a fight for survival. They grabbed what they could and ran for the stairwell, desperate to escape before the tower gave way. Fear replaced order, and in their panic, every second mattered. In the middle of this storm of confusion stood 21-year-old Antonius Gunawan Agung. He had been the one to grant clearance for Flight 6231 only minutes before. Now, as alarms sounded and the walls cracked around him, his colleagues shouted for him to follow. "Leave now! The building is collapsing," they cried. But Agung stayed rooted to his position. His radar screens still displayed the climbing aircraft, and he knew it had not yet cleared his airspace. If anything went wrong during these early minutes of flight, the crew would need instructions, and he would be the only one left to provide them. Duty overrode fear, and responsibility outweighed instinct. Around him, the tower groaned as concrete strained under pressure. Dust filled the air, choking his lungs, yet he kept his eyes on the screen, repeating the altitude and path in his head. To outsiders, it might have seemed like madness to remain inside a collapsing building, but for Agung, it was a choice rooted in commitment. He had dreamed of this job since childhood, guiding aircraft safely through the sky, and in the darkest moment of his young career, he would not abandon that dream. Seconds stretched into eternity. The tremors shook harder, sending deep rumbles through the steel supports. Outside the windows, he could see the airport grounds splitting apart and vehicles tossed like toys. Still, he refused to move until the flight was fully outside his responsibility. Only when the aircraft finally disappeared from his radar did he let himself turn away from the console. At that moment, the cost of his choice became clear. The stairwell had collapsed, and debris blocked every exit. The tower continued to sway, leaving him trapped 4 stories above the ground with no clear way down. In the silence that followed, Agung understood the weight of what he had done. He had guaranteed safety for 148 people he would never meet, but in doing so, he had placed himself in mortal danger. Yet even then, he did not panic. Witnesses later said he remained calm, searching for another escape route until the last possible moment. His courage inside that shaking tower became the difference between life and death for everyone aboard Flight 6231. But what would happen next to this young controller once the building finally surrendered to the quake? When Flight 6231 finally disappeared from his radar screen, Antonius Gunawan Aung turned away from his console, only to find that his escape routes were already gone. The stairwell had collapsed into rubble, and heavy debris sealed the doors. The tower swayed with each aftershock, groaning under the pressure, leaving him trapped 4 stories above the ground. He had completed his duty, but the price was isolation inside a structure that was slowly failing. Outside, alarms and screams echoed across the airport, yet inside the tower there was only dust, falling glass, and the deafening sound of cracking concrete. Rescue teams struggled to reach him. Workers tried to climb through broken sections of the building, but the constant tremors made the effort almost impossible. Every few minutes, another violent aftershock forced them to retreat. Still, they persisted, determined not to leave the young controller behind. Hours later, they finally reached him, pulling his crushed body from the wreckage. Blood pooled beneath him and his uniform was torn, but his breathing had not yet stopped. He was alive, but barely. The urgency shifted from saving him from the tower to keeping him alive long enough to reach proper medical care. At the nearest hospital, doctors faced an impossible situation. Hundreds of earthquake victims were flooding in, many with broken bones or deep wounds, but Agung's condition was far more critical. He had internal bleeding that could not be stopped with the limited tools available. His lungs had been damaged, and his body showed signs of severe trauma. The staff did everything they could, using what supplies they had to stabilize him. Plans were made for a helicopter transfer to a larger facility, one with the equipment that could save him. All he had to do was hold on. Minutes stretched into hours, and every breath became a battle. Nurses kept pressure on his wounds while doctors monitored his fading heartbeat. They knew time was against them, and as darkness settled over Palu, the helicopter never came. Roads were destroyed, communication lines were down, and the chaos of the tsunami made outside help nearly impossible to organize. In the end, the young man who had stayed at his post long enough to protect 148 strangers could not be saved himself. Just hours after his act of courage, Antonius Gunawan Agung died in a hospital bed, far from his tower, but still carrying the weight of his sacrifice. His final moments were not marked by fear, but by quiet endurance. Witnesses later said that even in pain, he remained calm, as if he understood the meaning of what he had done. The controller who had refused to abandon his responsibility had given everything for the safety of others. His story did not end in survival, but in something larger, a legacy of duty that would outlive him. Yet as his life faded, the passengers in the air were still unaware of the price that had been paid. How would they discover that their safe journey had been secured by the sacrifice of a young man they never met? High above the chaos, the cabin of Flight 6231 remained calm, almost peaceful. The passengers reclined in their seats, chatting with neighbors or dozing off to the steady hum of the engines. A few children laughed at the cartoons playing on their parents' phones, while others gazed at the fading light over the Indonesian coastline. None of them had the faintest idea that 3 minutes earlier had separated them from certain death. For them, it was just another routine flight, nothing more than a brief journey across the islands. Captain Mafela, however, could not shake the tension in his chest. He tried several times to reach the Palu control tower, but each attempt met with silence. Normally, such silence might suggest a minor technical issue, but on this day, it carried a different weight. The absence of a voice on the other end filled the cockpit with unease. Still, he kept his composure, guiding the plane northward, careful not to alarm his crew or the passengers behind them. It was his job to maintain control, even when the world below was breaking apart. As the plane approached Makassar, the crew prepared for landing with the same professionalism they showed on any flight. The wheels touched the runway smoothly, and passengers clapped softly, grateful for a safe arrival. Many reached for their phones, eager to text family or post about their trip, still unaware of the disaster that had consumed Palu. They collected their luggage, stepped onto solid ground, and walked into the terminal without the slightest suspicion of what had happened after takeoff. The revelation came only later, when Captain Mafela checked his phone. Messages poured in, news reports spread across screens, and videos showed the destruction in Palu, the cracked runway, the swaying tower, and the terrifying waves rushing into the bay. His heart sank as he pieced together the truth. The silence on the radio had not been caused by a glitch. It had been the sound of people fighting for their lives, and one young man who had stayed until his duty was done. The realization hit him with overwhelming force. Their safe flight had been secured by a sacrifice no passenger would ever see. For the travelers, the story of Antonius Gunawan Ong would emerge only in the following days, when headlines described the bravery of a 21-year-old controller who refused to abandon his post. Some passengers later admitted they were shaken when they realized how close they had come to tragedy, while others said they felt deep gratitude toward a stranger who had chosen responsibility over escape. What had seemed like an ordinary flight became forever linked to a story of courage and loss. The passengers of Flight 6231 stepped into their futures untouched, but their survival carried a hidden cost. They would go home to families, return to jobs, and resume their lives, while the young man who had cleared their path never returned home. His story raised a haunting question that hung in the air long after the disaster. How should a nation remember someone who gave everything for people who never even knew his name? In the days that followed, Antonius Gunawan Ong's name spread far beyond the walls of Palu's shattered airport. His funeral became a national moment, a scene of mourning mixed with pride. Soldiers carried his coffin draped in the red and white of the Indonesian flag, while thousands lined the streets to pay their respects. For a country struggling to recover from the quake and tsunami, his story offered a symbol of hope, a reminder that courage can shine even in the darkest hour. At only 21 years old, Ong became a figure larger than his short life. He had not commanded an army or held a powerful position, yet his choice in a single critical moment saved more lives than most people ever imagined. News outlets called him a guardian of the skies, while officials declared him a national hero. His sacrifice was not measured by medals or promotions, but by the 1,480 souls who stepped off Flight 6231 alive because he stayed at his post. Palu's airport was eventually rebuilt, and within its new walls stands a memorial honoring Ong and the other victims of that terrible day. For every pilot and passenger who passes through, it serves as a quiet reminder of the young controller who chose duty over escape. His story continues to be taught in aviation circles, where instructors use his example to show that responsibility can carry a weight heavier than fear itself. The legacy of Antonius Gunawan Ong is not only about tragedy, but about the values he embodied. He showed that age does not limit courage, and that dedication to a task, even in the face of death, can inspire an entire nation. His name has become part of Indonesia's history, not because of fame or fortune, but because he gave everything for strangers he had never met. And in the end, his life left behind a lesson that extends far beyond aviation. True heroism is often quiet, unseen, and born from a decision to put others first. Yet the story does not end here, because every act of sacrifice raises another question for those left behind. How do we measure the worth of a life given for others, and how should future generations carry that memory forward? The story of Flight 6231 reminds us that true heroism is not always loud or visible, but often found in choices made quietly under pressure. Captain Mafela trusted an instinct he could not explain, and Antonius Gunawan Ang stood firm until his final breath, proving that responsibility can outweigh fear. Their actions saved 148 lives and left behind a legacy that still inspires today. What do you think defines real courage in moments of crisis? Share your thoughts below, and if this story moved you, subscribe for more hidden histories that deserve to be remembered.